Welcome to the Dish on Divorce. I'm Leanne Townsend.
And I'm Jennifer Barkin.
And on today's show, we have a really interesting topic, which is business valuations and valuations for income support, because this is something that comes up with a lot of clients in the divorce area and mediation and whatnot. And so we're excited to have on the show Ryan Bensen of Bensen Industries. And Ryan is a business valuator and income, I guess you call it assessor or income valuator?
Forensic accountant and calculating income for support.
Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful to be here.
We're glad you're here.
So why don't you start by just telling listeners a little bit about what it is that you do?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my role in these circumstances is to come in, especially with self-employed people or where the financials are a little bit more complex, and talk about what this person's income for support payment would be or what their business valuation is. So I just come up with the numbers as an independent expert in court or in a mediation setting and give people a basis on which to work on.
And why is that necessary? Like why, if Joe, has his business and he's presenting his unaudited financial statements to Jill, his soon-to-be ex-wife, and he's showing a certain income, say the business is grossing $200,000 and he's reporting $20,000, on his tax return as his income after expenses. Why does Jill need you in this type of situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's interesting about these cases, and especially with self-employed people, is that there's a lot of tax planning going on. So you might have Joe and Jill in this example, and they're living this very exuberant lifestyle. They're driving nice cars. They have a cottage in Muskoka, but Joe is declaring $20,000 on his tax return. So does it make sense to base support on that? And the answer, of course, is no, it doesn't make sense unless it's really $20,000. So my role is to come in and let's look at the financial statements. Let's look at what's going on behind the scenes and develop a picture of what Joe actually earns every year.
I think it's really important. I have a file like that right now, exactly. And we were talking before the show started filming, where it's a high income family, but there's not a lot on the T4, right? And there is this business. But as a mediator, my job is to get the numbers or to hear the numbers, and then we begin a negotiation. My job is not to find out or to figure out what these numbers are. That's your role. And it's really important because I do have a little financial background, so I can read through the statements and I can see things like, what's this expense with this expense with this? What is this expense? But we need somebody to come in and say, this is what it is, because I'm not permitted to do that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And we run into this all the time in these cases where maybe there's personal expenses that are being run through the business. Maybe they bought a boat and they've expensed it for some reason. And they claim that, maybe I take a client on the boat once, but I'm going to expense the whole thing. And it doesn't make sense. This is clearly a personal asset that this person has bought, but is trying to deduct it for tax purposes. So my role is to come in and say, is this boat really a business expense? Probably not. So let's look at that and other issues.
You can entertain clients on a boat.
You could, right? And if you use it for business legitimately, show me the receipt. So show me what's, when you've used it, who was there,
how often,
what are the costs,
I guess,
how often? Yeah. I mean, how many times are you taking your kids water skiing versus how many times are you going on a booze cruise with clients?
Yeah. Exactly.
Now, when someone hires you, so going back to the example of Jill and Joe, does your approach differ whether it's Joe who's hired you or Joe, Joe's lawyer who got in touch with you or Jill? Are you truly objective, or, if you have, someone as your client, does that affect what you're doing and how you do it?
That's a great question. And it's something that we face all the time in this industry. And one of the most important parts for people who are looking at even retaining someone like me is to ask that question. As an independent valuator and expert for the court, I have to be independent and look at things very objectively. And the cost for me, if I don't do that, is when I go to court or when I present a report, the lawyer who's on the opposing side or the judge is going to look at it and rip it up because they're going to know that it's completely fictitious or biased. So my role, if you have two sides of the street, is to drive straight down the middle and communicate that in a way that makes sense to people as well.
Now, is there an advantage to, Joe going and shopping around to find a hired gun who's willing to do a valuation that's slanted, more in his favor, knowing that, if it gets to court, it'll be tested under cross-examination and things like that. But, is it worth someone trying to do that? Or, is your view, like that'll just catch up with you in the end. It's not worth the expense you're going to pay the valuator.
Yeah, so the hired gun thing is a good question. And what I think about when you see a report from a hired gun or somebody who might be known to be one is you want to look at the assumptions going on behind the scenes. So did they actually review the financials? So did they look at the financial statements? Did they look at the numbers behind the financial statements and how everything adds up? Did they look at invoices and receipts and things like that? These are things that will cue you as a lawyer or as a person going through this process when you're reading one of these reports and you don't see these little details in there, something is going on here. And maybe you should hire someone yourself to look and review it independently. In the hired gun situation, unfortunately, if you're facing a large income gap, so Joe has a ton of money, Jill has nothing. If he goes and hires a hired gun, somebody along the process needs to step in and say, we need to get somebody to combat this. Because otherwise, you only have one expert showing up and he's going to say the business is worth nothing. So it's important if you see those hired gun tells to say, we should really look at engaging someone here to see if this report that the hired gun has makes sense. And then let's look behind the scenes to see what's happening. So I don't think it works out for most people in the end.
I think it's really important when I mediate finances, right? And I can usually tell when somebody doesn't have a lot of financial savvy, and usually the business owner, he's a lot more aware and he'll recommend, let's use my accountant or let's, use one of my people. And I think really it's a value for you explaining what you're telling our viewers to know that, no, you actually need somebody in the middle who's a neutral, who's going to look at the whole story, because that business owner who's divorcing his wife or the business owner divorcing her husband is going to show numbers that work in their favor. Absolutely.
And there's bias in that if they're using their own accountant to prepare these things, because they may have had a relationship with that person for 20 years, right? So my role is someone who's totally outside of the process. I'll meet you, I'll talk to you, I'll issue the report, maybe it goes to trial and I'll show up then, and then I'll likely never talk to you again, right? So I don't have that ongoing 20-year relationship that would bias my skew here.
And you have no skin in the game other than to produce a professional objective report, whereas an accountant who's been like auditing somebody's, statements for the last 20 years, in that sense, they've been giving advice and they have a vested interest that their, advice is correct and not challenged by, anybody really. So you're coming at it completely objectively.
Exactly. And one of the things and tips that I talk to people with, because often I do work with the person who has no financial experience, hasn't been involved in the business, has been taking care of the kids and cleaning up around the house and making sure the family life is organized rather than just the business end. And one of my key things that I like to talk about is, let's get you up to speed financially so you understand what's going on. So you comprehend how this business works, how it's structured, how it makes money, how it, there may be some issues there. And that not only helps you going through the divorce process because you understand the mechanics of the business and you can articulate it in a way that makes sense, but it'll give you an additional level up post-divorce because now you understand how money works, which is really a key skill for anybody today.
And during the divorce process, it's also minimizing the power imbalance, right? Because financial abuse is common, and if somebody doesn't know anything, they can be taken advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that can be terrifying to see. And it happens a lot with these dynamics where there's somebody who's a very successful businessman or businesswoman, has control of all the money, understands what's happening with the money, and does things to hide it, right?
Yeah.
And then the other partner, whether it be the wife or the husband, has had no financial experience and has no clue what's going on, to the point that as long as the credit card clear or as long as the bank clears, they're not concerned, right? So let's help you take that step to become more competent in finance and more competent in understanding how business works, so you can communicate at least a similar level. So I tell people, by the time you're done with me, you're going to feel like you're an accountant, which I don't know if it's a good thing,
but it levels the playing field.
A little bit, yeah.
Now, do you do forensic accounting as well? Is that a service you offer to clients?
Absolutely. That's a specialty that I focus on. With any of these reports, I do like to include a certain element of forensics in that. And what that means is I want to look past just a tax return. So I want to see, how are these numbers derived? What expenses are being run through the business? And let's communicate on how these are legitimate versus not. And let's see some receipts. So there's always a little component to that. And if I happen to find some major issues, then we have to look deeper.
We see a lot of that. We see a lot of this hotel, the Ritz-Carlton for $600 a night. And I don't know, too many Morton's dinners and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's common. You see it a lot with vacations. You see it a lot with, I was attending a conference in Hawaii, but my wife came with me, the kids came with me, they went surfing and shark diving and all this stuff, but we've written it all off because I was at a conference. No, that's not how this works. There's a business component, and let's figure out what that is, but the rest is personal.
And with the cars, that seems to be another common one where everyone in the family has a car that's leased, to the company, and, like the kids included. And it, that to me is always a bit crazy, but it's done quite often. And as long as you're on the same page, I guess, and Revenue Canada isn't interfering in it, then you're fine. But if you divorce, it could be an issue.
It's definitely something to look at. And there's a difference between tax accounting, which is its own kind of thing, and it's codified, and there's some procedures behind that, versus income for support, where there are specific things that we want to look at. We want to normalize. What does it actually take to enjoy this lifestyle in terms of earnings? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the questions that I answer doing this.
What are some of the common challenges that you face when you get hired to, do an income valuation or a business valuation? Let's say Jill's hired you. What would be some of the common challenges?
It's tough to say because each case is a little bit in and of itself. So it sort of has its own challenge. But a commonality is a lack of disclosure, especially if I'm working for the non-income earning spouse. Yeah. So even getting financial statements or getting tax returns or bank statements can be a challenge, right? And we have to potentially even have to go to court to even receive these documents, let alone start talking about invoices behind it. So that would be one challenge. I mean, the second is always going to be on communication. So how do I guide this person through the process and help to educate them along the way and come up with a report that makes sense, right? And that is objective and unbiased and paints an accurate picture or story of what has been really happening with this family.
So it sounds like that the person who wants to show a very low income for support is not going to be too happy.
They may not be, and I've run into that before. But one of the key things, going back to the hired gun example, is you can find someone who will write numbers down on a piece of paper and make it look good, right? But is that going to stand up in court? Or is your spouse then going to go hire me, who's going to do a much more in-depth and a far better job that will beat your hired gun in court? And now you've incurred twice the expense because your spouse has hired me and you've hired the hired gun. and you're incurring way more expenses than you need to. So why are you spending all this money on professional fees when you can just get it done correctly in the first place, and hopefully that additional cost is mitigated?
One of the challenges I find with the financial disclosure, so I'm curious whether this happens with you. I mean, you mentioned that sometimes if you're hired for Jill, it can be hard, getting Joe to produce stuff. What I find happens quite often too in that situation is Joe will produce things very piecemeal, very disorganized. And then when you keep asking for more things, Joe's like, well, I've given you everything. But meanwhile, everything's a mess. And then it's like Jill's going to have to pay me and my people to sort through Joe's disorganized mess of stuff rather than Joe paying his people to have organized it and presented it properly.
Yes. I actually had one case that is a perfect example of that. And this person owned 4 different businesses, and there was money going back and forth and in between these businesses and all over the bloody place. And rather than give things document-wise in a PDF form, by email, instead they printed out 6 full reams of paper, not organized, not labeled, nothing, and just shipped it to my office. And I said, here. We provided it, and now it's my turn to spend hundreds of hours trying to figure out what the heck is going on.
But that's also a game too. Like, let's make somebody run out of money game.
Yes, let's bleed them out. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I have a file right now where that's happened, and we've just gone back to the other lawyer and said, sorry, you need to, we're not having my client pay my team to get all this stuff organized and tabbed. Like, you're required to produce a financial disclosure brief that's got an index and that's organized. So you need to do that. You may have provided us with everything, but we can't tell because it's all disorganized and all of that. And I mean, I haven't had a response from him yet, but but that's been an ongoing issue on that file. And and I've had other cases where they just produce massive binders. Again, like what you're talking about, not org. You're trying to figure out, okay, what is this? Like, how is this relevant? And one question I had for you as well, because it's pertains to another client I have right now. It was a very short marriage, and they're young and no children. And the ex-husband has multiple bank accounts, multiple mortgages, multiple loans from friends and family, and this whole crazy checkered thing of money going back and forth here and money going here. And it's really, really complicated. And, my gut feeling when I see something like that is that he's hiding, like why would anyone have such a complicated situation unless he's hiding something? And I don't know if that's a good rule of thumb or not really.
I mean, some people are just idiots.
Yeah.
And that could be the case, right? But it could be that a common way to distract and diffuse these things is to put up a wall of smoke, right? And that's exactly what you're talking about. So let's make everything as complicated as possible, as difficult to explain as possible. So if it were to hit somebody like me, it takes me a long time to figure out what's going on.
It's expensive for the client.
Exactly. And even then, it still is a little bit obfuscated because now I have to spend hours testifying or hours writing up this report about a chain of money going from A to B to C to D and up and down and all over the place. So it makes it challenging. So that throws up red flags to me that there's something else going on behind the scenes. I can't tell exactly what at this point, but if he's making a lot of money, maybe there's hidden assets, maybe there's, cryptocurrency I think is going to become the big one where people start hiding money because it's easier. So we'll see.
And also, with the friends and family loans that you see, aren't often those fake, right? Like, I lent money to you and I lent money to you, and it's just a way of showing I have no money to give you because look at all the debt.
Could be, right? So let's see if the money actually exchanged hands. That would be the first question that comes to mind. A common one that we see fairly often isn't that specifically, and I hope I'm not giving too many notes to people who might be watching this, but
too many tips and tricks.
Yeah, too many tips and tricks. But another common one that we do see is that people will, in quotes, lend money out of a business to a third party, but it's actually a private investment. So it won't be papered. It'll be declared as a loan. Look, I don't have cash flow. I don't have yada, 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 because they've spit all the money out. But they're claiming it's a loan when actually they bought a component of another company, but they're just not declaring it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And going back to the friends and family, on this case I was mentioning with all these different businesses and everything, that's what he's done. He's got all these loans to friends and there's no documentation or there's like something that could have been done at any point in time, between them. Yeah. And it's, to me, again, that doesn't withstand. Whereas I've had cases where parents loaned money saying it was a mortgage and they actually went and had a lawyer draft up a mortgage document with terms on it. And it was done, as a mortgage would be done. And so in that case, like, I think, they're well positioned to say that is that was a loan. That is a mortgage document. So
that's parents protecting their kids.
Yeah. Yeah. And themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's a bona fide loan, then sure. I mean, let's talk about that. But when it's, I took a 0% loan from somebody. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. For $500,000.
Yeah. Nobody's doing that.
And the spouse had no clue during the marriage, and all of a sudden, all of these, I owe money to so and so and to so and so and to so and so. I mean, that's a red flag.
It's an issue, definitely. And the question is, how do we tease that out in any sense? Would it be talking to the person? I mean, chances are they may lie about it and say, "Oh yeah, I lent him the money." So show me the paperwork behind it. Is it real? Did the money even exchange hands? Or is this just sort of, my friend Joey from the Subway shop lent me $500K, just to pay for these legal fees?
But if they wanted to be really clever, right? Okay, show me the paperwork. Couldn't you just draft up paperwork and backdate it and go, well, here it is?
Well, show me the bank statement. Mm-hmm. Show me the money.
Yeah, like there's going to be those objective third parties where you can't fake a bank statement. You can't fake a mortgage document that's from a proper mortgage, company or legal, unless you have a shady lawyer, which, sadly, I have seen some lawyers get into some shady stuff where they are, I don't understand why you would put your livelihood on the line for some of these things, but I guess with some people, if there's enough money, they'll do it.
Maybe, right? But show me the money.
Yeah.
That's the key. Show me the money.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I tell clients too, is like most things are traceable. Not, if somebody has a cash business, but even unless they're, putting the cash under their bed or in a safe, most people have some amount of stuff that's going to be, you're going to be able to follow a trail, or like you're going to see that there's a gap or whatever. It's very hard for somebody to completely hide things, but it is possible.
The key thing, especially with cash businesses or somebody who's successful but doing this income management, is men specifically who would be potentially in this higher earning role, when they start earning more money, they don't tend to just sock it away and live at the same lifestyle, right?
Right.
Men want to spend it, right? So I want to get the Porsche, or I want to get the Rolex, or, these sorts of things. I want a bigger house. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to take the kids on vacation, etc. Right? So it's not just about, I have money that's sitting in the basement. So if we can't trace the cash, let's look at what your lifestyle is, and then let's compare it to what you're saying your income is. Yeah. Because if you've made $20,000 per year over the last 10 years, there's no way that you can afford that Porsche in the driveway unless you're making cash.
Yeah.
But there are also people that plan for years to leave their spouse, and that gives them a heads up advantage because they're preparing, right? How hard is it to take monies and hide them offshore and then trace those funds?
It's harder and easier than you would think. And one of the key aspects, if you're talking about premeditated, pre-planned divorce, right? And this does happen. It's not very common, but it does happen.
They hate each other too much to just plan it out for that many years, I think.
Yes, yeah. But you run into the odd person, right? Who's a narcissist and is thinking 5 years ahead of the game, saying, I'm leaving this person in 5 years, but I need to put all my ducks in a row and I need to get everything organized. It makes it challenging, right? Definitely. But there's a few key aspects. Number one, if you're in a divorce situation, or if you're in a marriage and you're thinking, I don't have any financial background, I don't know what's going on, this is the time to start learning and start asking questions and start just sort of picking away and getting a better sense of things, right?
But if you're married to a narcissist, they're going to lie.
Well, they can lie, right? And that's fine. But you can also talk to some of your friends who might have business, some sort of business that they're running, and just start getting a general sense of how accounting works or how business operates, right? What does marketing do, et cetera? And where are some of the issues where you might find, are you expensing this car through your business? And you just ask questions of people and get a better understanding of how things work. When you're looking at a pre-planned divorce like this, generally on these cases, you're looking at a 3-year window from prior to the separation to look at income for support and those sorts of things. But when you start to suspect this premeditated aspect, that 3-year window doesn't make sense anymore because they will have put everything in place before that window. And there's no swing or sway comparatively. So we need to start looking at extending the window. We need to start looking at, how do you move assets? How do you move cash across a border? How do you make offshore investments? Is there an expense that they've incurred for setting up a business in Nevis, right? Do you see entries for cryptocurrency running through their banks or Visa statements or cash that's being withdrawn, but it just sort of disappears? Let's start looking at these things and figuring out a pattern. Because once people figure out something that works, they tend to repeat it.
That's true. And I mean, and the challenge with that sometimes could be, the standard is to go back 3 years. So as a lawyer, when you're requesting statements going back more than 3 years, inevitably you get resistance from the other side, and so you have to justify the relevance of it. And, sometimes that can be easier to do than other times. And sometimes you're just accused of, being on a fishing expedition and they're not going to provide it. And, then you need to decide, get a judge to order it or not. But I agree with you. Like, I think with a lot of things, like when there's a will, there's a way, but also it's the cost, like how much is someone going to spend on you and their lawyer? And, that gets very expensive.
It can be, right? And chances are you're going to go through that 3-year process before you realize, oh, this is something different and I need more information. So that would be the step to take to say, well, over the past 3 years, this person's done nothing. But it's not adding up. I'm missing pieces of the puzzle here. So we need to look at a longer time. And I think that there's exposure of, $100,000, whatever the number may be. So let's talk about that, what it might cost to even get the information before we analyze it and then take it to court.
Yeah, there has to be a lot of money at stake to make it worth the cost of finding it. Like if it's just $20,000, it's probably not worth digging that deeply.
No, you're not going to spend $100,000 to get.
Although some people would.
Well, people again, that's our narcissist. Yeah, narcissist has to win at all costs. So it has nothing to do with the money anymore. It just has to do with I need to win. Even though a logical person would say, well, if I won, $10,000, but I spent $100,000 to get there, that's throwing good money after bad money.
Yeah,
but the narcissist wants to win.
Yes, for sure.
I feel like we're saying narcissist a lot, but
we do.
Look,
it is
happens,
a common problem.
It turns into a game, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it becomes this game of win
cat
versus
and
lose, and cat and mouse, and how do I blockade things, and how do I think strategy, and suddenly everybody becomes a high-level family lawyer when they're narcissists, right, and going through a divorce. So, sure, let's play that game and let's figure out what we can get and start piecing the pieces of the puzzle together.
Sure, Leanne, you actually mentioned that in one of our other shows, that there, for some reason, that high conflict personality finds a lawyer that matches just well.
They attract each other. Like I find the high conflict clients seem to have the high conflict narcissistic lawyers. The narcissist client has the narcissist lawyer. The more reasonable client has someone like me. People seem to find the lawyer that's the fit for them, which is just it's interesting.
Interesting. Like I don't know, is there like a list? Right?
Yeah, if you're looking for
narcissistic family lawyers.
It's like the shark list.
By location.
That's so funny. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. This has been like such a helpful conversation for listeners. And I always find I learn something too every time I speak to you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And I'll send referrals your way.
I look forward to it. Thanks again for having me.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. I'm Leanne Townsend.
And I'm Jennifer Barkin.
And we'll see you next time.